On a spring morning in the year 1279 of the Common Era, in the waters off the southern coast of China, the last remnants of a once great empire prepared for a battle they knew they could not win. The Song Dynasty, which had ruled China for more than 3 centuries, which had presided over one of the most culturally and economically advanced civilizations in human history, had been reduced to a fleet of ships carrying a child emperor and the desperate survivors of a long and losing war. Their enemy was the Mongol Yuan Dynasty, the most powerful military force the world had ever seen, conquerors who had swept across Asia and Europe, leaving devastation in their wake. What happened in the waters near Yamen would not merely decide a battle or even a war. It would mark the end of an era in Chinese history and the beginning of something entirely new. This is the story of the Battle of Yamen, the last stand of the Song Dynasty, and the moment when China passed from native Chinese rule to foreign conquest for the first time in its long history. To understand the tragedy and the significance of what happened at Yamen, we must first look back at what the Song Dynasty had been at its height and what it had become by 1279. The Song had come to power in 960 CE, ending a period of fragmentation and bringing unity and stability to China. Under Song rule, China had flourished in ways that were remarkable even by the standards of Chinese civilization. The Song period saw extraordinary technological innovation, the development of movable type printing, advances in agriculture that allowed the population to grow to levels never before seen, improvements in navigation and shipbuilding that made China a maritime power, and the refinement of gunpowder weapons that gave Song armies a technological edge over their neighbors. But technology and cultural achievement could not entirely compensate for the Song dynasty's fundamental strategic weakness. The Song controlled the wealthy and populous southern regions of China, the rice-growing areas along the Yangtze River and further south. But they had lost control of the northern territories early in their history. The northern regions were controlled by various nomadic peoples, first the Khitan Liao dynasty, then the Jurchen Jin dynasty, who had proven themselves militarily superior to the Song armies in direct confrontation. The Song had adapted to this reality by building their state around economic and cultural power rather than military dominance, by using diplomacy and tribute payments to manage their relationships with the northern states, and by focusing their resources on internal development rather than military expansion. This strategy had worked reasonably well for centuries. The Song became wealthy and culturally sophisticated. Its cities grew to sizes that Europe would not match for centuries. Its scholars produced works of philosophy and literature that would influence Chinese thought for the rest of its history. Its merchants created trade networks that stretched across Asia, but the fundamental military weakness remained. And when a new threat emerged from the north, the Song's adaptive strategy proved insufficient. That threat was the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols had created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They had conquered the Jin dynasty that controlled northern China. They had swept across Central Asia, defeating every army that stood against them. They had invaded Eastern Europe and had reached the gates of Vienna. They were not merely another nomadic people seeking to establish a kingdom in northern China. They were a world-conquering force that would not be satisfied with anything less than complete submission. The Mongol conquest of China began in earnest under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan was not merely a military commander, but an administrator and a visionary who understood that conquering China required more than just military force. He established the Yuan Dynasty, proclaiming himself emperor in the Chinese tradition, and he began a systematic campaign to conquer the Song territories. The Mongol armies, with their superior cavalry tactics and their willingness to adopt Chinese military technology, including gunpowder weapons and naval capabilities, proved overwhelming. The Song dynasty fought back with everything it had. Song generals organized defensive lines, fortified cities, and attempted to use the natural barriers of rivers and mountains to slow the Mongol advance. The Song navy, which was superior to anything the Mongols had previously encountered, won victories in naval engagements, and protected the coastal regions. But the overall strategic situation was hopeless. The Mongols controlled the north and the center. They had more soldiers, better cavalry, and most importantly, they had momentum and confidence. The Song territories were being conquered piece by piece. By the 1272, the Song Dynasty had been reduced to a small region in the far south of China. The capital had fallen. Most of the great cities were under Mongol control. The Song court, carrying with it the symbols and the legitimacy of the dynasty, was forced to retreat constantly southward as Mongol armies pursued. The Song resistance was led not by the emperor, who was a child named Zhang Shijie, only 8 years old when he became emperor in 1278, but by a handful of loyal officials and generals who refused to accept that the dynasty was finished. Chief among these loyalists was a man named Lu Shufu, the chancellor and chief minister of the Song court. Lu Shufu was a scholar official of the traditional Chinese type, someone who had risen through the examination system and who embodied the Confucian values of loyalty, duty, and service. He had no illusions about the military situation. He understood that the Song could not defeat the Mongols in open battle. But he believed that preserving the dynasty, maintaining the legitimacy of Chinese rule, and resisting foreign conquest were duties that transcended practical military calculations. For Lu Shufu, surrender was not an option, because it would mean betraying everything that the Song dynasty and Chinese civilization represented. Alongside Lu Shufu were military commanders like Zhang Shijie, who commanded what remained of the Song navy. Zhang Shijie was a capable naval commander who had won victories against Mongol forces in previous engagements. He understood naval warfare, and he understood the coastal geography of southern China. He believed that the Song fleet, if properly positioned and led, could at least survive and perhaps even preserve some autonomous territory that the Mongols could not easily reach. By early 1279, the Song court and its remaining forces had been pushed all the way to the Pearl River Delta in the far south of Guangdong province. They established themselves on the island of Guangzhou, using the Song fleet to maintain control of the waterways and to protect the young emperor. But the Mongol forces, now under the command of a general named Zhang Hongfan, ironically, a former Song general who had defected to the Mongols, continued to press southward. Zhang Hongfan understood both Song tactics and Song psychology. He knew the coastal geography, and he commanded forces that included not just Mongol cavalry but also a substantial fleet that had been built specifically to challenge Song naval superiority. The strategic situation for the Song was becoming untenable. The territory they controlled was tiny. Their supplies were limited. The population that could support them was small and was itself under constant pressure from Mongol forces. Zhang Shijie understood that they could not hold their current position indefinitely. He proposed that the court should flee further, perhaps to Hainan Island or even beyond to Southeast Asia, anywhere that would put distance between them and the Mongol armies. But Lu Shufu opposed this plan. He argued that endless flight would accomplish nothing except to postpone the inevitable. He believed that if the Song dynasty was going to end, it should end with dignity and courage, rather than with the emperor fleeing into exile and eventual obscurity. He proposed instead that they should make a stand, that they should fight one final battle that would demonstrate the courage and the loyalty of those who refused to surrender to foreign conquest. This was not a military calculation, but a moral and philosophical position. Lu Shufu believed that how the dynasty ended mattered as much as whether it ended. The debate between Zhang Shijie and Lu Shufu represented two different ways of thinking about loyalty and duty. Zhang Shijie's position was that their duty was to preserve the dynasty and the emperor for as long as possible, even if that meant constant retreat and flight. Lu Shufu's position was that their duty was to preserve the honor and the principles of the dynasty, even if that meant accepting defeat rather than endless flight. In the end, Lu Shufu's position prevailed, though whether this was because his arguments were more persuasive or because the practical options for further flight were becoming impossible is unclear. The Song fleet gathered in the waters near Yamen, a narrow strait not far from modern-day Macau. The fleet consisted of perhaps 1,000 ships of various sizes, carrying the remnants of the Song court, the young emperor, and perhaps 200,000 people, including soldiers, officials, servants, and civilians who had fled south with the court. Zhang Shijie organized the fleet into a defensive formation. He chained many of the ships together to create a stable platform and to prevent the Mongol forces from breaking through the fleet easily. The strategy was to use the superior size and stability of the connected Song ships to create a defensive barrier that would be difficult for the Mongol fleet to penetrate. The Mongol forces, under Zhang Hongfan's command, approached Yamen with a fleet that was perhaps slightly smaller than the Song fleet, but was more maneuverable and more aggressively commanded. Zhang Hongfan understood that the Song were trapped. They had nowhere to retreat. They could not replenish their supplies. Time was on the Mongol side. But Zhang Hongfan also understood that the Song fleet, if allowed to escape, might continue to resist for years, becoming a rallying point for resistance throughout southern China. He needed to force a decisive battle and to destroy the Song fleet completely. The Battle of Yamen began on the 19th of March, 1279. The Mongol fleet approached the Song defensive formation and attempted to break through the chained ships. The initial attacks were repulsed. The Song defenders, fighting from the larger and more stable platforms created by their chained ships, were able to use their superior numbers and their defensive advantages to hold off the Mongol attacks. For hours, the battle raged in the narrow waters of Yamen, with ships burning, arrows filling the air, and soldiers fighting desperately on swaying decks. But the very strategy that gave the Song fleet its defensive strength also created a fatal vulnerability. The ships that were chained together could not maneuver. They could not respond to changing tactical situations. They could not retreat or reposition. When the Mongol forces began to concentrate their attacks on specific points in the Song defensive line, the chained ships could not adjust their positions to reinforce those weak points. The Mongol forces, using smaller and more maneuverable vessels, began to exploit these vulnerabilities. As the battle continued, the Song defensive formation began to break down. Mongol forces broke through the outer lines of ships and began to penetrate deeper into the Song fleet. Individual Song ships, finding themselves surrounded and cut off from support, either fought to the end or attempted to surrender. The careful defensive formation that Zhang Shijie had constructed was fragmenting under the sustained Mongol assault. Zhang Shijie, seeing that the battle was lost, made a desperate attempt to save the emperor. He fought his way to the imperial ship with a small group of loyal followers, intending to cut the chains, free the ship, and flee with the young emperor to fight another day. But he found that Lu Shufu had anticipated this possibility and had acted to prevent it. Lu Shufu was not going to allow the emperor to flee and to live in exile under foreign domination. He believed that such an outcome would be a betrayal of everything the dynasty stood for. What happened next became one of the most tragic and iconic moments in Chinese history. Lu Shufu, wearing his full official robes as chancellor of the Song Dynasty, approached the 8-year-old Emperor Zhao Shi. Historical accounts suggest that Lu Shufu spoke to the young emperor, explaining that the dynasty had fallen and that death with honor was preferable to life under foreign rule. Then Lu Shufu picked up the child emperor and, carrying him on his back, jumped from the ship into the waters of Yamen. Both the chancellor and the emperor drowned in the Pearl River Delta. With them died the last hope of the Song Dynasty's survival. When news of the emperor's death spread through the remaining Song fleet, the resistance collapsed. Many officials and soldiers, following Lu Zhifu's example and believing that death was preferable to surrender, jumped from their ships into the water. Historical accounts suggest that tens of thousands of people died this way, choosing suicide over capture. The waters around Yamen were said to have been filled with bodies for days after the battle. Some Song ships attempted to break free and escape, but most were captured or destroyed by the pursuing Mongol forces. Zhang Shijie managed to escape with a small number of ships, but he died shortly afterward in a storm, ending any possibility of continued Song resistance. The Battle of Yamen marked the complete conquest of China by the Mongols and the establishment of the Yuan Dynasty as rulers of all China. For the first time in Chinese history, the entire country was under foreign rule. The Song Dynasty, which had been one of the most culturally and economically advanced civilizations in the world, had been completely destroyed. The death toll from the battle and its immediate aftermath was catastrophic. Perhaps 100,000 people died at Yamen, most of them by drowning or suicide, rather than in direct combat. The fall of the Song Dynasty had profound consequences for China and for world history. The Yuan Dynasty, under Kublai Khan and his successors, would rule China for nearly a century. The Mongol conquest brought China into a larger world system, connecting it more directly with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The Mongol period saw increased cultural exchange, with ideas and technologies flowing between China and other parts of the Mongol Empire. Figures like Marco Polo traveled to China during this period and brought back accounts of Chinese civilization that fascinated Europeans. But the Mongol conquest also brought significant changes to Chinese society and government. The Yuan Dynasty implemented a system that privileged Mongols and other non-Chinese peoples over Han Chinese. Chinese scholar officials, who had been the backbone of Song administration, found themselves marginalized. The examination system, which had been the traditional path to advancement in Chinese society, was suspended for much of the Yuan period. Chinese cultural traditions, while not entirely suppressed, were subordinated to Mongol preferences and priorities. For many Chinese, particularly the scholar official class that Lu Zhifu had represented, the fall of the Song was not merely a political or military defeat, but a civilizational catastrophe. They viewed the Mongol conquest as the triumph of barbarism over civilization, the replacement of a sophisticated and cultured society with rule by nomadic conquerors who did not understand or value Chinese traditions. This perception shaped how later Chinese historians and writers remembered the Song Dynasty and the Battle of Yamen. Lu Zhifu's decision to kill the emperor rather than allow him to live under Mongol rule became one of the most debated actions in Chinese history. To some, it represented the ultimate expression of loyalty and devotion to principle. Lu Zhifu had chosen death with honor over life with shame. His action demonstrated that there were values more important than mere survival, that loyalty to one's dynasty and one's civilization could require the ultimate sacrifice. This interpretation made Lu Zhifu a hero, a model of Confucian virtue and loyalty. To others, Lu Zhifu's action was a tragic waste and a failure of his duty to protect the emperor. They argued that as long as the emperor lived, even in exile, the dynasty continued and hope remained. By killing the emperor, Lu Zhifu had destroyed that hope and had ensured that the Song dynasty ended completely. This interpretation saw Lu Zhifu not as a hero, but as a man whose devotion to abstract principles had led him to commit an act that was ultimately destructive and pointless. The debate about Lu Zhifu and his decision reflects deeper questions about loyalty, duty, and the meaning of civilization. What does loyalty require when the cause is lost? Is it more important to preserve life and the possibility of future restoration, or to maintain honor and principle even at the cost of death? Is civilization something that can survive military defeat and foreign rule, or is it fundamentally tied to political sovereignty? These questions had no easy answers, and Chinese thinkers would continue to wrestle with them for centuries. The Battle of Yamen also had a profound impact on how Chinese people thought about their relationship with the outside world, and particularly with nomadic peoples from the north and west. The Song Dynasty's fall demonstrated that military power mattered in ways that cultural and economic sophistication could not entirely compensate for. The Mongol conquest showed that China was vulnerable, that its civilization could be conquered by peoples that Chinese culture had traditionally viewed as barbarians. This realization would shape Chinese strategic thinking and foreign policy for centuries. Yet the Mongol conquest was not permanent. The Yuan Dynasty lasted less than a century before it was overthrown by a native Chinese rebellion that established the Ming Dynasty in 1368. The Ming Dynasty consciously presented itself as restoring Chinese rule after the interlude of foreign domination. The Ming emperors and their officials looked back to the Song Dynasty as a model of proper Chinese governance and culture. They honored figures like Lu Shifu as exemplars of loyalty and virtue. They portrayed the Yuan period as an aberration, a temporary disruption of the natural order where China was ruled by Chinese. The memory of Yamen and the Song Dynasty's fall influenced how the Ming Dynasty approached questions of defense and foreign policy. The Ming invested heavily in military capabilities, particularly in fortifications and in the navy. They were determined that China would never again be conquered by foreign powers. The Ming reconstruction of the Great Wall and the establishment of a powerful Chinese navy reflected lessons learned from the Song Dynasty's fall, that military power was necessary to preserve Chinese sovereignty, and that cultural and economic achievement alone were not sufficient. In the centuries after Yamen, the battle became enshrined in Chinese cultural memory as a symbol of loyalty, tragedy, and the cost of resisting overwhelming force. Poets wrote about the drowning of the emperor and the suicide of the loyal officials. Artists depicted the final moments of the Song fleet. Historians debated the decisions made by Lu Shifu and Zhang Shijie. The battle became part of the foundation of how Chinese culture thought about loyalty, duty, and the relationship between the individual and the state. The battle also became relevant again in later periods, when China again faced pressure from foreign powers. During the 19th century, when European powers were forcing unequal treaties on China, and when Japan was rising as a military threat, Chinese nationalists looked back to the Song Dynasty's resistance to foreign conquest as an example and a warning. They honored the loyalty of figures like Lu Shifu, while also recognizing that resistance required not just courage and devotion, but also effective military force and sound strategy. The site of the Battle of Yamen is now marked by a memorial that honors the Song loyalists who died there. Visitors can see monuments to Lu Shifu and to the young Emperor Zhao Shi. The memorial presents Yamen not merely as a military defeat, but as a moment of supreme loyalty and courage, as an example of how people can choose to die with honor rather than to live with shame. The memorial reflects how Chinese culture has chosen to remember Yamen not primarily as a story of military failure, but as a story of moral courage and devotion to principle. Yet the Battle of Yamen also reminds us of the terrible cost of such devotion. The tens of thousands who died in the waters around Yamen did not die in a glorious victory. They died in a defeat that accomplished nothing except to avoid the humiliation of surrender. The young emperor, whose death was supposed to preserve the honor of the dynasty, was a child who had no say in his fate. The officials and soldiers who jumped into the water following their emperor left behind families and communities who would suffer under Mongol rule without the leadership and support those people might have provided. The tragedy of Yamen was not that the Song dynasty fell by 1279. That outcome was probably inevitable given the balance of forces. The tragedy was that so many people died in the final moment, that the end was so catastrophic and so complete, and that a civilization which had achieved so much found itself unable to preserve its political independence despite all its cultural and economic accomplishments. The battle raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between military power and civilization, about what is worth dying for and what is worth living for, and about the costs of resistance when the outcome is already determined. The Battle of Yamen marked the end of an era in Chinese history. The Song Dynasty, with all its cultural achievements and its economic sophistication, was gone. The period of division between North and South, which had characterized much of Chinese history since the fall of the Tang Dynasty, was ended. China was unified under foreign rule for the first time. The world that the Song had created, a world of commercial cities, sophisticated culture, and relative social mobility through the examination system, was transformed by Mongol conquest into something different. Yet Chinese civilization survived Yamen and the Yuan Dynasty. The language, the culture, the philosophical traditions, the social structures, all of these persisted and eventually re-emerged when Chinese rule was restored under the Ming. In that sense, Lu Shufu's fears that foreign conquest would mean the end of Chinese civilization proved to be overstated. Chinese culture was resilient enough to survive foreign rule and to eventually reclaim political sovereignty. But the memory of Yamen remained as a warning and as an inspiration. It warned that military power mattered, that cultural achievement could not substitute for the ability to defend sovereignty, and that even great civilizations could fall if they were not prepared to resist foreign conquest with effective force. It inspired because it demonstrated that some people valued honor and principle more than survival, that loyalty and duty could require ultimate sacrifice, and that even in defeat there could be dignity and courage. 3/4 of a millennium have passed since that spring morning when the Song fleet made its last stand in the waters near Yamen. The dynasty that died there is long gone. The empire that conquered it eventually fell in turn. The specific details of tactics and troop movements are matters of historical debate. But the questions that Yamen raised about loyalty and duty, about civilization and power, about what is worth dying for and what is worth living for, these questions remain as relevant today as they were in 1279. The Battle of Yamen stands as a reminder that the great turning points of history are not merely about military outcomes, but about choices people make in moments of crisis, about what they value and what they are willing to sacrifice to preserve those values, and about how the end of one era carries within it the seeds of what will come next.